Thank you. Good afternoon. How many of you in this room have had a conversation that's gone sideways? Someone didn't understand what you meant, you didn't understand. Okay, who has never had that happen? Because then I'm going to have you come up here and teach this session. Okay. So we've all had experiences where we communicate something, it's not received as we intend, or someone communicates something to us, we misunderstood that intention. This is to be human. 90% of misunderstandings and communications are related to misinterpretation and communication problems. So it's a very pervasive problem. In 2014, my mentor taught me the secret of the causes of miscommunication, and I felt very, very privileged to have that information bestowed upon me. And today I'm going to bestow it upon you. Are you ready? Yeah. The 3 causes of miscommunication are you, them, and you and them together. But I am going to go into a little bit more detail than that. So I want to tell you a little bit about a time that I had the privilege of having a miscommunication on the global stage of LinkedIn. It was quite a privilege to have this experience because it taught me a great lesson. So I write a lot of articles, and I wrote an article in 2015 called What Your Shoes Tell an Interviewer. Now this is a topic I write on a lot. My next book is about interviewing, so I felt confident in this space. I was staying in my lane. Normally when I write posts on LinkedIn, this is the type of comment that someone would place on my article. Very helpful post, thank you, great read, I'm going to share it. Well, when I wrote this post, I had some interesting comments. So it's a little different than what I was used to. I thought, what happened here? But before I talk about what happened, I'd like to talk about, first of all, what is communication? We need to level set what we're talking about here, right? So first of all, communication is I'm sending an intended message, I'm conveying an intended message to you, and you receive that message. But here's what's important. We have mutually understood signs and rules. So we have references that we're familiar with, cultural, pop culture, historical references, and that helps provide the context for what I'm talking about. We also have a mutual understanding of our language, not just verbal, but body language as well. We have mutual understanding of tone. We understand when someone is speaking with sarcasm to us, regardless of what their words say. So we have this mutual understanding. So ultimately, the goal of communication is to be understood and also to understand. And both speakers should have that goal. But there's a famous quote that says, most conversations are monologues with a witness. So let's talk about why do we communicate in the first place. There are only 4 reasons why human beings communicate to one another. I'm trying to persuade you or influence you in some way. You need to really go and eat at that restaurant. It's a great restaurant. And sometimes people make it a personal mission that I need to start doing CrossFit. But I'm an indoor girl that I like to have a book in front of my face or a computer. I'm not doing CrossFit, so no matter how much you try to persuade me, you might have to switch to inform me. Maybe I'll live longer, and you start giving statistics about why. So we want to inform people. Sometimes it's just a simple communication of letting someone know the meeting is at 3 o'clock and the room has changed. We also communicate to self-express. This is an area where we can get into a lot of trouble because we're trying to communicate our feelings, which are very complex constructs, to another person. And sometimes when we're communicating that self-expression, the person is hearing this, and this is all your fault, by the way. And the 4th reason is for pleasure, just recreation, meeting up with a friend for coffee and just enjoying each other's time. So those are the 4 reasons that we communicate. So let's go back to what happened with my post. So first of all, you may not be aware of this, but 70%, and I know that they say that 100% of statistics are made up on the fly, but that's not what I'm doing here. This is based on research by Inscape Publishing, who produces the personal listening profile. 70% of what we communicate to someone else is filtered out or changed. That's staggering that we can even communicate at all knowing this. But why is that happening? So let's talk about why that's happening. There are 3 buckets of reasons. So I am going to give you 3 reasons, but they're not nearly as glib as what I started out with. The first is explicit versus implicit messaging. I remember saying to my son, I'd like you to unload the dishwasher today. If you get time, if you have a chance, that would be great if you could do that. And then when I came home, the dishwasher wasn't unloaded. We said, well, if you had time, but I was busy. We try to be polite when we communicate to people, so we take a direct message and we put politeness around it, and we end up having implicit messaging. I had a certain expectation, right? So we have different expectations, and so did he, because I didn't communicate clearly and directly. The second reason is the content expectations. I'm sitting in a performance review with my manager. I know I did great this past year. I rocked it out. And now this person's telling me some problems I've had. And I'm thinking, this doesn't resonate with me because I know that I was a rock star this year, so surely you're mistaken. So I'm not expecting to hear from you what I'm hearing. And so I'm filtering that out. La, la, la. I'm not hearing you. The next reason is our listening style. You may not be aware of this. If you follow me on LinkedIn, you should know this. But there are 5 different listening styles, and 2 of those listening styles are feeling-oriented, and 3 of them are information-oriented. So if you're speaking to an information-oriented listener, and you are a feeling-oriented listener, they're listening for, what are you trying to tell me? What are the facts so I can make a decision? And here you are talking about your feelings. So they're trying to disregard the things that don't matter to get to your point. And your feelings may have been the point, right? So this listening style difference is huge in creating miscommunication. And then this last one, I learned this lesson the hard way. We assume people are going to trust us because we know our intention. So in 2010, I started managing this new team of 31 people. And I was going to develop these people. I was going to be the best manager they ever had. So I told them, I'm going to do the StrengthsFinder assessment with you, and we're going to have a workshop. And it was great. And then my phone rings, and one of the nurses I manage says to me, are you doing this to use it against me in my performance review? And my heart sunk, because I love to be a developer of people. I'm a lover of people. And how could someone assume harm? Well, I don't know if she's ever done an assessment. I don't know if she's done it and it was used against her. I don't know if she had a manager that was vindictive and vengeful and always was trying to get back at her. I don't have the context of her experience. So I wanted them to trust that I had good intentions. But you can't assume trust. You have to earn it. So the first are differing expectations. The second is your message delivery in the first place. So complexity. A recruiter posted on LinkedIn the other day that she read on someone's resume that they had a large and impressive vocabulary. You put that on their resume. Because we all know large and impressive vocabularies are what make communication clear, right? So complexity are using too much industry jargon. When you're talking to your customers, you have to be very careful about not using your industry jargon that they don't understand. It's very clear to you. It is very confusing to them. Also, trying to cram too much into your message, too much information. You want to make sure you are addressing the single most important message that that person needs to hear, and not trying to cram 10 pounds of potatoes into a 5-pound bag. One-way communication. You're trying to communicate something very complex, maybe a change in your business, and you're just sending an email out. And I will tell you, most people do not put themselves in the shoes of their audience who are reading that communication, and you end up creating more questions than you answered. So this is very important. Blunt versus tactful. There's a difference between being direct in your communication and being blunt, right? No filter. So when you're very blunt with people, it tends to make them shut down. And so they're not hearing you because you've put them off with your approach or your message delivery. But the same is true for being too tactful. Anyone ever watch Parks and Recreation here? I love that show. There was an episode where, and I don't remember their names, but Quincy Jones's daughter was broken up with by Rob Lowe's character, and he was so tactful she didn't realize they had broken up. When she tried to get together with him again and she realized what had happened, she was like, wow, this is embarrassing. But he danced around his message so much that the message was lost. So you can go too far either way. Another message delivery issue is logic versus emotion. You have someone who's speaking from a feeling-oriented place, right? And somebody just wants the facts. And so they're reading your email or they are hearing what you're saying, and the content doesn't align with what they need. And finally, the format. I had a client one time. I love this client to death. But she sent me this email and she said, here's what I'm thinking about sending to one of my stakeholders. What do you think? And I said, I think you shouldn't send that email. You're trying to do too much in it. It's way too long. And if there's any chance that there could be conflict whatsoever by anything you say, email is not the format. So texts and emails are not always the best communication choice for complex or potentially conflict-laden discussions. Okay? Then the last one, and this is a huge obstacle, misinterpretation. I can't necessarily control how people interpret what I say. First, you have to know that people have a negativity bias. If you send an email that is ambiguous in any way, people will assume that you mean something negative. Our brains, the amygdala in our brain is the survival center of the brain, and it's meant to protect us. So we assume things are negative so we can protect ourselves. It's just the way we're wired. So you have to keep that in mind. Is there any possibility this person could apply the negativity bias, and how can I use my body language and tone or language to ensure that that doesn't happen? Mental filters. This one is huge. There's a saying that says we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we are. And that is so true. And if you can remember this and you can conduct your communication with this in mind, it will make a huge difference in your life. So I construct these templates based on my age, my race, my gender, my socioeconomic status, my political leanings, my experiences that I've had in my life. And that's what I see everything through. So if I have someone in my past who was very abusive to me, the next time someone fits that profile and there's any question of their intent, I'm going to assume it's negative. Okay? And then the last one is simply just poor listening and inattention. How many of you have been on a call and you've talked to someone and they say, I'm sorry, could you please repeat the question? Because people start multitasking when they're on the phone and they don't pay attention. So now what do we do about all of this? It's nice to know what's going on, but how do we fix this?
What did you just say?
The first thing is you need to know your audience. So if you have a customer service arm of your business, you have to know who are these people that are calling in for help. What do they care about? What's important to them? I looked up to see who are the types of people who would be coming today and why would they care about communication. Knowing your audience is really key. I mentioned this. Simplify your communication. Don't try to do too much. Don't try to use a lot of jargon. Keep it simple. Listen more than you speak. This is hard for some people because they're naturally verbal people. But the fewer words you say, the less can be misunderstood. Use an appropriate format. I've heard that people are firing people via text message nowadays. This one is going to take a little more time to explain. Speak from an adult state. So I don't know if you've heard of Eric Berne, but he created, and I'm going to explain this, but he created a model called transactional analysis. And you can actually pinpoint the time and place that a communication goes sideways because of this model. You start out communicating from an adult state. An adult state is I'm assertive, I'm direct, I'm confident, but I'm respectful. I use a combination of a caring tone and candid words. That's the ideal state. But there are two other ego states, a parent state and a child state, okay? You start out at the adult state. Can you explain why you missed the deadline? And you get a response. It's unfair. No one around here has as much work as I do. That is a wounded child response. A rebellious child response is, well, if you're so great, why don't you do it yourself? But oh, yikes. But what happens is that crosses the transaction. I start out from adult, and the transaction gets crossed. I put myself in a child state, responding either as a wounded or rebellious child, and I create the other person's role as the parent role over me because I'm subordinating myself as a child. It's a victim mentality or a rebellious mentality. Now, the parent state, there are really three ego states, but only two of them matter for the context of what we're talking about. The first is the critical parent. Can you please pass the salt? Why didn't you think of that before you sat down? It's talking to someone like they're a child. So you have the critical parent, but then you have the rescuing parent. That's the codependent person that treats the person like a child, but I'm trying to save you from yourself. Okay? So listen to how people talk. Are they going into a parent or a child state? Those conversations never go well because nobody wants to be put as the parent when you're acting like a victim or rebellious, and nobody wants to be subordinated to the child when they're an adult. So pay attention to this. Which of these ego states do you tend to speak from when you're in conflict with someone? Because I will tell you right now, if you stay in the adult state, the conversation will never degrade. You'll just keep going back and forth. I'm sorry, perhaps I misunderstand your intention. Here's what I heard. Can you elaborate and tell me what you meant by that? Oh, that's not what I meant at all. Sure, I'm happy to explain. And that adult state will continue until you come to resolution or agree to disagree. This is what causes communication to turn into conflict right here. Okay? So let's look at the remaining tips. Focus on seeking truth, not who's right. I used to manage a call center and operations, and I had a large team, so different people would touch different customers' accounts. And sometimes a patient would call in, and the person would say, oh, I see, Josie had touched your file and she did this wrong. The customer doesn't care who's wrong. And there's a lot of research that shows when you make it right for a customer, they become loyal fans. So this throwing people under the bus never works. What's the truth here? What are we trying to get down to? Not who's right or wrong. Stating opinions as facts. Hillary Clinton is. Donald Trump is. Anytime you see people using the word is, they're stating an opinion as fact. If you just add two words to the end of that, you're good. To me. That joke was offensive. To me. Now it's a fact. But people go around and saying, that was offensive. That's offensive. Well, a fact, the majority of people will agree with. So you have to be very careful about stating opinions as facts and making assumptions. If people would just ask, this is what I heard, this is what I thought, this is how I interpreted this. Assumptions are, you know what, Henry Winkler actually, there's a quote that Henry Winkler, he said about this, he said, assumptions are the termites of relationships. Mm-hmm. Rise above those filters we talked about. Be a curious observer. There was a woman who did a TED Talk. Her name is Megan Phelps Roper. She was a member of Westboro Baptist Church. And because she was willing to rise above her filters, people on Twitter would challenge her about the beliefs of her church. And she actually ended up leaving the church. And now she talks about love and acceptance and listening to other people. If people hadn't risen above her filters, she would have stayed a member of that church and be picketing soldiers' funerals. The last one is embrace vulnerability. So this is where I want to come back. What went wrong with my article? I didn't pay attention to my audience. I had a homeless person who read that article talking about worrying about your shoes. Now I said, I'm not talking about expensive shoes. I'm talking about making sure your shoes are clean. But I wasn't paying attention in defining my audience for that article. And it went around the world. So of course there are going to be people who that did not resonate with. You have to define your target audience and make sure that you clearly state who your audience is in your communications. The other thing that I did was I used some opinions as facts. There are lots of people who wouldn't care about people's shoes, but I made it seem like this is important. Everyone's going to judge you by your appearance, and that's actually not true. So I made a couple of these errors myself, but here's what I did. I went back and I read the post 2 years later, and I wrote a follow-on post. And I said, I can see your point of view, the people who didn't agree with me, that why you would think I came across as shallow, why the advice was ludicrous. And that post got 50,000 views and 7 reshares and hundreds of comments of only positive comments because people respond to vulnerability. So if you have a communication going sideways, you can recover it through genuine vulnerability and transparency and authenticity in your communication. The homeless person who had criticized me was wishing me a good day by the end of the conversation because I kept it in the adult state. So I would leave you with a quote by John Powell who says, "Communication works for those who work on it." It's not something that's going to come naturally. So what questions do you have?
Your original article, what wording would you have changed to not offend those people that you did?
I'm so glad you asked that question. I felt like I tried to accomplish too much. I told stories about one woman who would come into the interview in 5-inch stilettos. That really had nothing to do with my message. That just your legs are often crossed in front of the interviewer, and if they're dirty, if you've stepped in mud or you haven't polished your shoes, they're going to see a dirty foot in front of them. That was really my point, and I really wandered off my communication point. So that was the first thing that I would do differently. I would have stuck to the main message. What's the one big idea here? The second thing that I did is I didn't consider this global audience where someone had said in the comment, you know, where we live in Asia, during the rainy season, everyone's shoes are muddy. So I could have easily said, I'm speaking to people who work in a corporate environment in the United States. I could have, recognizing this is a global platform, some of you may not agree with some of this advice because it's culturally specific. So that is one of the things I would have done differently, is really define the audience. And also, I should have slept on it. I wrote that article off the cuff and published it. All of the other articles I've ever written, I would save them in a draft mode, read them again later, and often have my husband read them too. And I didn't have him read that article.
Why not?
You know what? It was one of those days where I was just in a rush to get it out the door. I had a lot going on.
That's a big change from
Yeah.
every single one to that one specific.
Yeah, I just remember having a lot going on and thought I should probably have him read this, and I was like, nah, just publish it. And it really came back to bite me.
Are we going to have a printout? I'd love to be able to teach this in my office, because this is really good. I'm an office manager.
I am happy to share this presentation. Laura has it. She can send it out to everyone who attended. I have no qualms about that.
How do you bridge that gap between being able to use email and still avoid that conflict and
Yep.
not having the outside?
So what you need to implement in your meetings is something called an agreement building conversation, and it's very simple steps. The first thing is, what did we decide today? You can do that after an agenda item is complete, before you shift to a new topic. You can do it at the end of the meeting, but what did we decide today? Who is doing what by when? Who needs to know about this? And what is the messaging and the tone of that message to ensure everyone's aligned? And if you say, hey, we're just going to do a new process to improve our meetings and make sure the follow-on happens, and then you verbally do that, and then you follow up with the email, then it's not cover your butt. This is now just the way we ensure good communication. That's an excellent question.
So, when you were talking about your negative feedback and doing what we do with Family Law, we get a lot of positive things about our post too, and we try to be helpful. But I know early on, I wrote one about divorce, and something about the headline to it, the title to it, made it sound like we were saying, yay, divorce.
Right.
Okay? So anyway, the article was talking about, is divorce right for you? And it really was more of an analysis of, if you're finding yourself in these situations, you might want to consider, we're not going to tell anybody to get, but we got the most hateful thing from somebody that was like, this is all you care about, and you're out there telling people to go get divorced, and I was like blown away by it.
That person wasn't your target audience.
How, in that situation, okay, expressing vulnerability, I was stumped because I was like, do I say, I'm sorry you feel that way, and then that sounds kind of condescending, so how do you express that to a criticizer?
That's an excellent question, and you want to start first with your why. Why am I writing this post? Why is this important? Have people continuously come to you and ask these questions? So that's what you do, is you want to explain your why. Why are we here and why are we talking about this? This may not be for you, but what we have found by talking to hundreds of people every year is these are the questions we're continuously being asked, and so now what we're trying to do is to try and help you before you come in, and you're not having to pay us to answer these questions, but we want to provide them as a service. So your why will help go a long way of explaining why you're writing that, because they haven't considered an alternate option. Right. You're writing it because you want to drum up business and make money from people's misfortune, and that's not what's going on. It's just helpful to ask the question, is there anything I can learn from what this person is saying, and be open and curious about their perspective. But really beyond that, you're right, you can't always please everyone. It's an impossibility. You have to remember when you're communicating with people, they don't know the intent and they don't have your context. So anytime you're communicating, if you can explain your intent and provide context, it goes a long way.
So for communications, boss, employee, or manager to subordinate, where the boss is consistently using the parent language, what advice do you have for the employee?
So you can attempt using a feedback model. I call it a straight talk conversation. The first thing you want to do is explain what you observed, not you're rude, you're disrespectful. Those are interpretations of what you heard or saw.
It's more like, the codependent parent.
Oh, still, it's like, oh, let me do your PowerPoint for you because I can make it look so pretty, or whatever they're doing. So here's what I've observed. In the last 3 meetings, you spoke up to help me finish my thought, or whatever it was. And then you say, I'm concerned because, and you show the impact. I'm concerned because that may undermine my credibility with the team, whatever. And then when you share the impact, then you offer to help. When you give people feedback and you offer to help, how can I help improve this process? How can I help better understand your expectations so that I can be allowed to do this independently? How can I help? It's not taking on more work. It's working in partnership with the person to improve the relationship, the process, or whatever it is that's breaking down. It's very difficult for people to get defensive when you end up with a how can I help? How can I help build your trust in me so that you don't need to check in with me every day? How can I proactively give you what you need so that you feel comfortable with me taking this on autonomously? Straight talk. Well, I appreciate your engagement and your attention. Thank you.